A trail camera in the Florida Panhandle was only supposed to confirm a routine detail. Instead, it caught two small shapes moving across the forest floor. Shapes that field biologists had spent 7 years hoping to see, and had almost stopped expecting. Those two shapes were eastern indigo snake hatchlings. Not captive-bred, not released, born in the wild, to wild parents, on land that hadn't produced a wild indigo in over 4 decades. And the moment that footage was confirmed, it stopped being a nice conservation update and became something much bigger. A signal flare in a war most Americans have never heard is happening. To understand why 2 baby snakes made grown scientists go quiet, you have to understand what's chasing them from the south. The eastern indigo snake is the longest native snake in North America, capable of stretching past 8 feet. With iridescent blue-black scales and a temperament so calm that early Florida settlers reportedly kept them around homesteads to control venomous snakes. It's non-venomous, immune to pit viper venom, and it eats almost anything smaller than itself: rodents, frogs, other snakes, even the occasional young rattlesnake. By the 1980s, it had vanished from most of North Florida. Habitat fragmentation, road mortality, and the collapse of the longleaf pine ecosystem it depended on pushed it out. At the Nature Conservancy's Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle, the species hadn't been documented since 1982. Bringing it back meant rebuilding an entire ecosystem first. Longleaf pine forest once covered more than 90 million acres of the southeastern coastal plain. By the early 2000s, that had collapsed to roughly 3 million acres before conservation efforts began pulling it back toward today's 5.2 million. The Conservancy and its partners restored longleaf pine stands at Apalachicola Bluffs and reintroduced gopher tortoises, whose burrows the indigo relies on for shelter from fire and cold. Only once that groundwork was in place did the actual snake reintroduction begin. Starting in 2017, the Central Florida Zoo's Orion Center for Indigo Conservation began breeding and hatching indigo snakes, raising them for roughly 2 years with help from the Welaka National Fish Hatchery, then releasing 2-year-old juveniles into the restored habitat. Every spring for 9 consecutive years, another cohort went into the ground. By 2025, that had added up to 209 snakes released at the preserve. The 2025 cohort of 42, the largest single-year release in the program's history. For the first 6 years, the project measured success in survival. Snakes recaptured, snakes tracked, snakes still alive on the landscape. Then in the fall of 2023, cameras caught something the program had been quietly hoping for since day one: 2 wild-born hatchlings, offspring of the released adults, moving through the preserve on their own. Nobody had touched them. Nobody had radio tagged them. They existed because 2 previously released indigo snakes had found each other, mated, and produced viable young in restored habitat that, a decade earlier, couldn't have supported them at all. Michelle Hoffman, a biologist with the Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, called it exactly what it was: one of the clearest markers a reintroduction program can hope to see, because it means the population isn't just surviving on human effort, it's reproducing on its own. Brad O'Hanlon, Reptile and Amphibian Conservation Coordinator for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, went further, describing the Apalachicola Project as one of the state's gold standard conservation efforts. Subsequent monitoring seasons kept adding confirmation. A 6-foot male spotted in late 2024, a female from the very first 2019 release cohort still alive and healthy years later, and cumulatively, close to 500 eastern indigo snakes now returned to the wild across the Florida and Alabama release sites combined. That's the good news. It's real, it's measured, and it's the product of nearly a decade of unglamorous field work, walking transects, checking camera traps, sorting through hundreds of thousands of photos, looking for one snake among pine straw and palmetto. But the reason this particular species was chosen for one of the most ambitious reptile reintroductions in American history isn't really about restoring a pretty snake to its old range. It's about what the eastern indigo is built to do to something else entirely. 400 miles south of the Panhandle, the Everglades is dealing with a problem the indigo snake happens to be perfectly designed to fight. The Everglades isn't a swamp in the way people imagine. It's a shallow, slow-moving sheet of water spreading across roughly 1.5 million acres of the southern Florida peninsula, feeding the drinking water supply for millions of residents, buffering hurricane storm surge for the lower Atlantic coast, and recharging the aquifer the entire region depends on. A 2025 study from the Everglades Foundation and Earth Economics put an annual value on those combined ecosystem services at over $31 billion, with a 50-year asset value approaching $1 trillion. And researchers involved in the study argued that figure likely understates the true value, since the worth of the region's freshwater supply alone is difficult to fully price. It's one of only 3 sites on Earth holding UNESCO World Heritage status, International Biosphere Reserve designation, and Ramsar wetland recognition simultaneously, the other 2 being the Great Barrier Reef and the Galapagos Islands. Into that ecosystem, over the course of about 2 decades, came the Burmese python. The first one was documented in Everglades National Park in 1979, a single animal, no cause for alarm. Through the 1980s and 90s, though, Miami became a major hub of the American exotic reptile trade, and Burmese pythons became a popular, cheap pet. Hatchlings barely 20 inches long, sold for the price of a video game. What the pet trade didn't advertise clearly enough was that those hatchlings grow up to 4 feet a year and can eventually reach 15 to 20 feet and well over 100 pounds. An animal most apartment or suburban owners were never equipped to keep. Some escaped. Some were deliberately released into canals when they outgrew their enclosures. And in August 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through a reptile breeding operation near Homestead, releasing an unknown number of captive snakes directly into the wetlands. Wildlife officials at the wildlife biologist Ian Bertashek's own conservation organization have described the honest answer to how did this happen as multiple choice: escaped pets, deliberate releases, and hurricane dispersal all contributed. Genetic research published in 2011 confirmed pythons had been breeding in the wild in southern Florida since before 1985, and by 2000, officials confirmed a self-sustaining, reproducing population inside Everglades National Park. The federal government banned interstate transport and importation of Burmese pythons in 2012. Florida outlawed private ownership outright in 2021. By then, it was far too late for either measure to matter much. Current population estimates run from the tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands. And because pythons are ambush predators built to sit motionless and camouflaged, researchers with the Everglades Foundation have noted that for every python a person actually spots, field estimates suggest somewhere between 100 and 1,000 more go undetected. The clearest evidence of what all those unseen pythons were doing came from a 2012 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by Michael Dorcas of Davidson College along with 10 co-authors, including federal and state wildlife scientists. The team repeated nighttime road surveys along the same routes used in 1996 and 1997, this time covering nearly 57,000 kilometers between 2003 and 2011. The results were stark. Compared with the earlier surveys, raccoon sightings had dropped 99.3%. Opossum sightings had dropped 98.9%. Bobcat sightings had fallen 87.5%. Marsh rabbits and foxes weren't detected at all during the entire 8-year survey period. Not reduced, just absent from the data. The researchers found these declines were most severe in the parts of the park where pythons had been established longest, and that populations remained comparatively healthy at survey sites outside the python's range, a pattern that let them link the collapse directly to the snake rather than some other cause. The study's authors noted that the scale of the decline pointed to an extraordinarily dense python population already present in the park, and warned that the same pressure likely threatened rarer, harder to survey native species even more severely than it did common ones like raccoons. A 2015 follow-up experiment, published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, tested the mechanism directly. Researchers released radio-tagged marsh rabbits, both inside Everglades National Park and at python-free control sites. Within the park, pythons killed more than 3/4 of the tagged rabbits inside 11 months. At the control sites, predation from pythons was zero. A 2021 follow-up survey found that the geographic footprint of python-linked mammal decline had roughly doubled since the original 2012 study, with no sign of recovery. Florida hasn't been passive about any of this. The state has run the Florida Python Challenge hunting competition since 2013, funded professional contractor removal programs since 2017, tested thermal imaging drones, and pioneered the Judas snake method, fitting a captured male python with a radio transmitter and releasing him to lead researchers back to breeding females during mating season. Ian Bertashek's team, working with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, has used that technique since 2013 to remove more than 20 tons of python biomass and prevent an estimated 20,000 eggs from hatching. None of it has come close to solving the underlying problem. Removing a few hundred pythons a year from a population that may number in the hundreds of thousands barely dense reproduction. Thermal drones struggle because pythons are cold-blooded and blend into the ambient temperature of the wetland rather than standing out against it. Baited traps don't work because pythons are ambush hunters that wait for prey rather than search for food. In 2023, the U.S. Geological Survey stated plainly what field researchers had suspected for years. Full eradication of Burmese pythons from southern Florida is, by their assessment, no longer a realistic goal. Here is where the story stops being only about pythons and mammals and starts being about something almost nobody outside herpetology has heard of. Burmese pythons didn't cross the Pacific alone. They brought a parasite with them, Rhylidiella orientalis, a pentastamid, technically a crustacean rather than a worm, that lives in the lungs of its host. In python's native range across Southeast Asia, it coexists with them at low manageable levels, the product of a long shared evolutionary history. Melissa Miller, an invasion ecologist affiliated with the University of Florida, first documented it in a native Florida snake back in 2012 and traced its origin to the invasive pythons themselves. Florida's native snakes had no such history with it, and the parasite has spread through them with startling speed and severity. Its life cycle runs through two intermediate hosts. Infected snakes shed parasite eggs in their waste. Cockroaches and other invertebrates ingest them. Small vertebrates like frogs and lizards eat the infected invertebrates. And when a native snake eats one of those frogs or lizards, the larvae migrate to its lungs, mature, and start the cycle over. No python required at any later stage. The spread has been documented rigorously. Researchers first confirmed the parasite in 6 southern Florida counties around 2017. By 2019, it had reached Alachua County, more than 100 miles north of the nearest established python population. A 2025 study led by Jenna Palmazzano and colleagues at the University of Central Florida documented the parasite in 14 additional Florida counties, beyond what had been recorded the year before, bringing the total number of known affected counties into the mid-20s to 30s, depending on the survey. It has now been confirmed in at least 18 to 19 of Florida's roughly 46 native snake species, from banded water snakes to black racers to dusky pygmy rattlesnakes. And researchers involved in the tracking effort have noted that native, smaller-bodied snakes often carry heavier infection loads than the pythons that introduced the parasite in the first place. Sometimes over 100 individual parasites recovered from a single set of lungs, according to comparative data cited in the 2025 research. In small-bodied species, that's frequently fatal. Researchers have described finding animals like dusky pygmy rattlesnakes dead with the parasite visibly emerging from the mouth after the infection filled the lung cavity. Unlike the python itself, this parasite isn't limited by cold winters. It survives inside its host regardless of the temperatures outside, which means it isn't bound by the same climatic ceiling that keeps Burmese pythons, a genuinely tropical species, largely confined to central and southern Florida. Researchers who study the spread have specifically flagged human-assisted movement, including the pet trade, as a likely accelerant, pushing the parasite's range outward faster than natural dispersal alone would explain. Which brings the story back to Apalachicola. The eastern indigo snake reintroduction was never framed as sentimental. It was framed as tactical. The FWC's own description of the project treats the indigo's return as a way of putting a wide-ranging, snake-eating apex predator back into a landscape now overrun by a giant invasive constrictor. Indigo snakes are documented predators of a broad range of other snake species, and researchers involved in Everglades python control work have pointed to native predator learning, bobcats, alligators, and yes, indigo snakes, increasingly targeting python hatchlings and juveniles as a slow but real form of ecological pushback. A 2023 study published in Management of Biological Invasions, led by researcher Melissa Curillo and colleagues, was the first to formally document native Florida wildlife preying on invasive pythons in the scientific literature, cataloging confirmed predation by alligators, cottonmouths, and other native species. But the two hatchlings born at Apalachicola aren't growing up in a simple two-sided fight. They're growing up in the middle of three separate, converging pressures. From the south, the python's range keeps creeping northward as waterways warm. From somewhere in the middle of the state, the Doralidiella orientalis parasite keeps expanding its documented range, unconstrained by the cold snaps that limit the python itself, moving through frogs, lizards, and roaches toward every native snake population in its path, including, eventually, whatever population of wild indigo snakes eventually spread south out of the panhandle. And from Apalachicola itself, a genuinely wild-born indigo population is trying to grow fast enough and spread far enough to become the predator its reintroduction was designed to create, before the parasite reaches it first. None of that makes the two hatchlings any less of a genuine milestone. Reintroduction biology is slow, expensive, and usually invisible to the public until a moment like this. A camera catching something that shouldn't exist yet, on a schedule researchers didn't expect. Michelle Hoffman and her colleagues have spent close to a decade building toward exactly this kind of evidence. A population healthy enough, established enough, and secure enough in its restored habitat to reproduce entirely on its own terms. What happens next isn't something any single agency, contractor, or field biologist controls. It depends on which of Florida's slow-motion biological transformations moves faster over the next decade. An apex predator rebuilding itself from 9 years of careful, patient reintroduction work, or a parasite spreading through a swamp it was never supposed to reach, riding a wave of ecological disruption that started with a handful of $10 pet store snakes 40 years ago. There's also a broader, more sobering pattern here worth sitting with, one that goes beyond this single species pair. A follow-up study published in Biological Conservation in 2021 extended the original mammal decline research years further into the invasion and reached an even harder conclusion than the 2012 paper. Native mammal populations in the hardest hit, longest invaded parts of the Everglades still showed no meaningful sign of rebounding, even after prey species theoretically had time to adapt to a predator they had no prior evolutionary experience with. In other words, this isn't a shock the ecosystem is simply absorbing and recovering from. It's a suppression that, in the areas where pythons have been established longest, has essentially held for decades. Field biologists tracking python movement have separately noted a behavioral shift in the snakes themselves. Animals in heavily hunted, human-accessible areas appear to move toward less accessible terrain over time, which researchers interpret as evidence that sustained removal pressure is selecting for more cautious, harder-to-detect pythons, meaning even the control side of this fight is shaping the invader into something harder to fight. That's the context the Apalachicola hatchlings are stepping into. They're not just a wildlife success story sitting quietly in a preserve. They're the newest variable in a set of ecological processes that have been running in parallel for the better part of 3 decades. A python population still expanding and still functionally impossible to eradicate. A parasite spreading through the state's native snake species faster than researchers can fully map it. And a reintroduced apex predator whose long-term success now depends on outrunning a threat nobody had fully identified when the project began. Conservation programs rarely get to declare clean victories, and this one won't either. What they get, instead, is exactly what happened at Apalachicola this year, a data point. 2 wild hatchlings, born free, moving through restored longleaf pine, representing 9 years of careful, unglamorous fieldwork, and at the same time, the opening move in a race whose outcome nobody currently studying it is willing to predict. For now, the cameras are still rolling. The hatchlings are still out there, somewhere in the restored longleaf pine of the Florida panhandle, growing longer, moving through a landscape their species hadn't successfully reproduced in for over 40 years, carrying, whether anyone planned it this way or not, a role in a fight that's still being decided one field season at a time. Botanical Gardens Orient Center for Indigo Conservation, Fish and Wildlife.